Hey Laura, how are you today? I'm so excited for today's episode. Today's really fascinating. Like we're going to talk about some stuff that we have not covered on this podcast before.
Yeah, we've got a formidable guest coming on to talk about a huge project, which hopefully is going to be beneficial for kids all over the world.
Yeah, so our guest, well, we're going to let our guest introduce herself. So let's just cut right to it.
So, we always like our guests to introduce themselves. And this week we have the awesome Lucha Sotomayor. Lucha, please can you introduce yourself?
Hi, thank you, Laura. So I'm Lucha. I work for the UN, specifically for a mandate called the Office of the Special Representative of the UN Secretary General on Violence Against Children. I specifically work on children's participation, how children are part of the solutions when it comes to preventing, addressing, and responding to all forms of violence. And on violence online, we all work on different forms of violence. That's the one that I focus on. And I'm also the author of a couple of books, one of them for children, one of them called Yo Digital, which is a book to empower children to be the best version of themselves online.
And do you have children of your own?
I do. They're 11 and 13, just like going into the online world, starting their own adventures,
Well,
which is very challenging as a parent.
Yes, good luck to you.
Thank you. I need it.
Um, and we feel your pain, Lucha. We're both parents too.
So I have to say your job sounds really fascinating. But I'm kind of suspecting that most of the people listening don't really think about what violence against children means on a global scale UN kind of question. I mean, at least not beyond like when we're all doom scrolling through our phones, right? And we hear the sensational headlines. So like, what are the major issues that you deal with in that office right now?
Okay, that's a huge question.
Yeah, sorry.
No, it's fine. So we are an advocacy-driven mandate. So what we do is we work with member states, that's UN language for countries that are members of the UN, which is most countries. We work with states around improving and strengthening their response to violence and to all forms of violence. So the violence against children is huge, right? So people tend to think about the physical violence against children, right? So the act of physically harming a child,
Right.
which is of course violence against children, and generally, there's a whole aspect of corporal punishment that we work on in schools, at home, and how not to discipline children through force, right? And also you have psychological violence, you have verbal violence, you have different forms of violence that are not, that people may not think that they're violence against children, but they are, like child marriage, like
Mm.
harmful practices, like child labor, child trafficking. So basically anything that goes against that there's the conventions of the rights of the child, and children, according to the convention, have the right to live in a world free from violence. Anything that is a bottleneck towards meeting that right is considered violence against children, basically. So depending on the region of the world, the kinds of violence that are most urgent to address, right? So, for example, child marriage is huge in Africa. It's always something that countries in the region are working around. Violence online is something that is cross-cutting throughout all regions. Unfortunately, things like sexual violence and domestic violence, they are too, depending on countries. The violence experienced by children on the move, refugee children, migrant children, displaced children.
Mm.
So a lot. And
Yeah.
unfortunately, COVID did set us back a few years towards meeting our goals. We had the goal of ending all forms of violence against children by 2030, right? So I guess you're all familiar with the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, and 16.2 is putting a stop, ending all forms of violence against children. So we work to meet that goal. And it's a lot of work, unfortunately.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
It is. It sounds huge, but a really important piece of work nonetheless. And I'm really pleased that you mentioned the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And actually, I'm aware that recently there was also the digital rights of the child were being considered in that space as well. One of the ones that we're really interested in is child participation and the right to participation. Can you explain a little bit more about what the convention is and also this idea of child participation?
Okay, so the convention is a human rights treaty. It was the human rights treaty that was approved the fastest in history. That means countries adhering to it and saying yes, we're going to take these recommendations forward. And participation is one of the core principles and guiding principles of the convention, and it means that different rights, the right to express yourself, right, the right to access information, the right to peacefully associate, for example, all go into the mixer, and what comes out is children's right to participate and influence all matters affecting them, right? That is what we understand by participation. And participation was kind of born with the Convention of the Rights of the Child, which we're going to refer to as the CRC because it's shorter. It was kind of born with that a bit over 30 years ago. And the interesting aspect is it has evolved a lot, right? So at the beginning, adults were the gatekeepers of participation, right? So children actually needed adults to open up spaces for them to speak up and, say what they wanted. That has evolved to, it's not enough to speak up. You actually want to make sure that those voices are influencing decision making, right? And also with social media and with children's empowerment, because 30 years in, the children who have been born are educated around the CRC. I am 41. I was born and there was no CRC, right? And then when I was an adolescent, probably nobody educated me on the CRC when it was approved. So I was not empowered around my rights. Today, children learn in school that they have the right to participate. They learn about the CRC. They learn about their rights. So that empowerment, together with the fact that, a lot of children, not all children in the world, but a third of children have access to the online and to certain channels that are enabling environments for them to take forward their rights. If you combine these two aspects, it means that adults are no longer the gatekeepers of participation anymore, and children are taking those spaces. Let's look at Greta. Let's look at child-led movements looking to influence change. Now, adults are still the gatekeepers of programs and policies affecting children, right? So there's still a need to bridge that gap. So what we do at the office that I work for is we work towards bridging that gap between children who are taking forward actions around violence and other issues, and they're looking to influence change, and decision makers and world leaders and those actually behind the programs and policies that are affecting these children. How do we support the first group with knowledge and tools to influence change, and how do we support the adult world into channeling children's participation towards affecting positive change for them and their communities?
Yeah, so actually that sort of really reminded me something. So recently I joined a project that you are heading up called the POP Project. And I think that would be a really good opportunity to speak a little bit about that. Could you explain what the project is and actually how that links with this idea of child participation as well?
Yes, I'd be happy to. So POP stands for Protection Through Online Participation, right? And it's about this whole aspect of children participating online, but we narrowed it down to participating towards being safer, right? So we always look at the online world as a place where children are at risk of different forms of violence, right? And they still are, and we still need to work towards making it safer. But there's another side of the online world, and that is how, thanks to this, digital access to the digital world, children are being able to be safer. So just like they're able to express themselves, access information, peacefully associate, they're also able to work towards their right of being free from violence, right? The best example is during COVID. We saw how many children went into lockdown and services were interrupted. When we say services, are the services protecting children, right? So a helpline or school, teachers, health professionals, violence. So children don't report violence, violence is detected, right? So there are trained professionals that are going to be working with a child, engaging with a child, and they're going to pick up on certain things that, maybe warnings about a child being a victim of violence. And children don't report for a number of issues, right? Being scared, being ashamed, not knowing that what they're experiencing is called violence and it's wrong. And that's why adults pick up on those things and help children and guide them towards reporting system services. With COVID, those were interrupted in over 100 countries in the world, right? And children were disconnected from services, and domestic violence and sexual violence increased. So children were very often, living with the perpetrators of violence and disconnected from the protection services. And the online world became a very critical entry point towards being safer, connecting to a helpline, right? Reaching out for help, connecting to the police, right? It was a channel that was that helped children be safe, right? And also children started to create their own solutions towards being safe, right? There's this beautiful example about a girl in Poland, and she created a website to report gender-based violence. And it's a fake cosmetics website, depending on the type of product that you buy, the type of violence that you're asking, that you need help around. And you can even talk to a sales assistant who was a protection officer who could guide you through. That was created by an adolescent girl to address violence and to support her peers. So children are owning the online world to access safety. Services are adapting their channels, helplines. Child Help International, for example, during COVID had to increase in almost 20% their online staff and volunteers to address children's requests for help online. Now, HOP is about better understanding how children are using the internet to be safer. If we understand it well, from the user's perspective, from the service provider's perspective, from helplines perspectives, if we understand it better and we understand the challenges that both children and services are facing, we can make recommendations for improving or implementing these services. As the UN, we should be anticipating these trends and being able to provide relevant info for all countries to take these services forward.
I love this. I love this project so much because, Laura and I talk about this all the time, right? How so much of the conversation around the online world and digital is about the danger or keeping it safe, and at the best, sometimes it's like, oh, there's positive ways you can learn spatial reasoning, right? Or projects. Or critical thinking or learning games, those kinds of things. And for years we've been, even when we do this podcast, we're always talking about how there's so many powerful ways that young people are using online tools to connect with affinity groups, to get help, to find the support that they need. And while researchers talk about this all the time, this is not in the mainstream conversation about the digital world at all. So I love that you're doing this project that from my understanding, you're not only identifying the examples, you're mapping them, you're describing how they work. Go ahead. I was going to ask you to talk about it.
So to your first point, completely agree. And I think the challenge is, how do we understand these systems and make sure that they're also safe spaces for children to connect with, right? How do we make sure that it's not always an entry point, it's not just an entry point to safety, but it's also a safe space to access safety. And we still need to be working towards making the internet safer and more ethical and child-friendlier, etc. So I think they add up, right? It's not like either or, but they should be combined. And then how are we doing it? So we started off by bringing partners on board from other UN agencies. This is being co-led by our office and ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, which is the agency within the UN that basically addresses telecommunication issues. Brought in UNICEF, other UN agencies, CSO, Save the Children, Child Help International, anyone, Save for Internet Centers, organizations that are touching on the online and children's rights at the same time. Also, relevant industry players such as Roblox, such as Meta, the legal group, Disney, they're all involved in this initiative and with the goal of understanding how children are using the internet to be safer, and some academia partners and children themselves and helplines. And we first started to map. We, outlined this form, asking services. We mapped services, official helplines, official hotlines, adult-led, adult-led, or by governments who are looking to provide protection to children through digital means, and where there's a conversation. That was one of the criteria. We need to map these places where there's a conversation between two human beings, one of them a child looking for support. And we received information from almost 200 countries, and we're currently going through all that information, from how many children do you engage with, through which technologies, which are your challenges, which are the benefits. We're starting to map now child and youth-led solutions, and asking children and young people how they're using the online world to access safety. What platforms do they mostly interact with the goal of looking for safe, with the goal of being safe? And the question is, if you are feeling scared or unsafe, where do you go online, right? To look for help. And that's we call it the second phase of the mapping. Then we're going to be mapping, the third phase is we're going to be mapping all other platforms that are not necessarily a service or child-led. And these we're envisioning that there's going to be a lot of AI-driven systems and games and things around mental health. And we're combining that with qualitative information, running in-depth interviews with helplines who are supporting children online, and asking them more in-depth. Let's talk about the process. Were you born online? Did you have to activate this channel? Why? When? How many iterations have you gone through? Which do you think are the challenges for children? We're going to also interview children and young people who have been behind these solutions. We are going to be looking at children's evaluations of these services, interviewing industry players to understand what they have learned about children using their platforms to be safe. From our conversations with many of our industry partners, we've learned that it has been a challenge, and that children, for example, during COVID, when playing online games, when in social media, they would be looking for support systems as well. And there is a big challenge on how to bridge them, right? How do social media platforms, how do online gaming platforms, and generally platforms where children engage, how do they bridge with protection beyond report the account, right? How do we actually connect with protection human beings, and not necessarily AI, who are able to protect children? The protection community has always been focused on the offline aspect for obvious reasons, because we detect violence, right? So there are additional challenges in taking that to the online world. How do we address them? Because children will continue to go online. They will increasingly look for help online. So we need to understand that, so we are up to speed, so we can provide the support that they're asking for. So we're incorporating the lessons from the industry, doing some lit reviews, so throwing all of these different data inputs into a mixer, and then looking at the evidence. So this is what the world is telling us, right?
Yeah,
and then from that, with all these partners, we're hoping to get them together physically in person, not just online, and work with this information to make recommendations for countries, right? So the recommendations will be, country X, have you implemented these services? No, we haven't. Here's a set of recommendations how you can. Oh, yes, we have. Okay, here's a set of recommendations how you can make sure that it's meeting the following standards and it's being effective.
Can I mean, there's got to be some big challenges here in terms of cultural perspectives and sort of the geopolitical stuff, right? Like, just take the LGBTQ plus questions, for example, like really big differences in terms of cultures and whether and what they consider violence and justice and in certain issues. How do you navigate those kind of distinctions? I'm sure what I consider to be violence is not the same everywhere else.
No, and different communities experience violence in different ways. And some
Yeah.
communities are more vulnerable to experiencing violence, especially minorities, right? Um, I'm actually a board member of this organization in Chile. It's called Todo Mejora, It Gets Better. It's an LGBTIQ plus organization that helps prevent adolescent suicide from homophobic, transphobic, lesbian discrimination. And we have a helpline that functions online, right? And children reach out asking for help. And 1 in 2 users get to the online helpline with suicidal behavior. 1 in 2 users. That's half of the
So
children who
sad.
reach out to her, right? Because they're being discriminated inside their homes, because they have an additional layer of discrimination, right? So we need to identify these services that are addressing specific groups of people. In our forum, we're asking, like, do you engage with the following communities, right? So to understand which percentage of these services are being built and tailored to respond to the needs of minority groups. Whenever we work in a global forum, we need to think about these cultural sensitivities, and we cannot ask, for example, in the gender question, we cannot give out options that may be illegal in some countries, although we may support them, right?
Right.
Personally, or as organizations. The way but then you don't want to leave them out, because
Yeah.
then you are excluding children and specific communities from being able to not only respond from their own identity and their own perspective, but also you're not collecting really relevant information that could be used for your analysis. The way that we navigated that, and we had a huge discussion on this actually on the for the forum, because it's easier for the forum for services if you engage with the following communities, but for the child and for the forum that is going out for children and young people, we had this discussion, because you don't want to limit this forum. If you include certain options, some countries may not distribute it, and then you may not be able to collect that information. And the very elegant solution that we came up with was the gender question, leaving it open-ended. Rather than giving options, we're asking, what is your gender, right? And although it's more work in going, when analyzing the information, we felt that it was worth it, because we could collect a percentage, the views from children and young people who may not identify with binary gender classifications and may feel freer to express it in an open-ended question. But it's always a challenge. It's always a challenge, because it's not just about cultural sensitivities. It's also about children not feeling safe if they respond to such a question. It's also about, for example, not collecting any personal or identifiable information. It's also complying with privacy and privacy criteria on collecting information from children. So each word that is being chosen for that forum has been very carefully selected. Yeah, very thoughtful.
Yeah.
Of course, the inherent assumptions in any forum are already issues of inclusion and exclusion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Always.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it sounds obviously you're so passionate about these kind of, the online space and the world. Why is it such a focus for you? I know we mentioned that you've got 2 children, but what sorts of issues keep you up at night? What do you worry about?
Oh, God. How long do you have? Yeah, I think, that's a really tough question. I started to work on technology about 20 years ago, and empowerment through technology. I worked, that evolved into working for UNICEF for a few years. I worked for the Office of Innovation, the Global Office of Innovation, managing this program called U-Report, which is an adolescent participation tool where children respond to service through their phone, and that's real-time data looking to influence programs and policies for UNICEF. Right? UNICEF works more at a global level, of course, at a global, but on all children's rights. The office that I work with, we only focus on violence, but of course we would work on gender, on health, on education, on early childhood development. And that on one hand. So I started to work a lot a few years ago, I mean, many years ago now, on children's issues and on technology. When I was in school, I was bullied. When I was in fourth grade, nobody knew anything about bullying back then. It wasn't a concept. It didn't exist, right? It was normal. And I did start to get really involved as an adult in bullying specifically. And from my work at UNICEF. So from bullying, I started to work a lot on violence. And then a few years ago, I'm going to say about, I don't know how many years ago, but about 10, I started to work really close to the connection of violence online, bullying, and then, violence and technologies, right? And for me, it's, I feel that as a parent, there's a huge gap. And I think that I would dare to say that this is the largest generational gap that we've ever had in history, right? Because parents grew up without rights, right? Because most, not all parents, but most parents, let's say most parents of adolescent children are likely to be over 30 something, right? So when they grew up, there was no CRC. So that's something new for them. Nobody brought them up nobody taught them about their rights. In fact, their rights were not respected because they didn't exist, right? And probably they grew up without social media and without technology because the CRC and the World Wide Web were born at the same time, right? So Tim Berners-Lee created the hyperlink around 1989, around the same time when the CRC was approved. So these two huge world-changing phenomenons were born at the same time, and parents did not. Nobody taught them about this, right? And then you have their children affected by both of these things, affected positively and negatively, right? And parents have the huge challenge of knowing how to raise and protect their children in this world, and they don't have the information, the means, the know-how, the knowledge on how to do it. That keeps me up at night, right? That's my main thing. And that's generally, I wrote this book, which is, hang on, I have it right here. So it's
excellent plug there, Lucha.
Because
there we go.
But it's
you gotta keep
an
it close to your face to keep it in focus.
There, right? Okay, but it's sold out in Chile. I'm sorry, but it's being sold in a few countries now. But it's a book about the internet, and it's not a book about the risks online. It's about the internet. It's about how the internet was born, when it was first conceived, how it evolved to the World Wide Web. Why does it function the way that it functions, and why are people expected to protect themselves? It has a lot to do with how the internet was born and who were behind, the minds behind that, and how that landed on the world, and the world had to take responsibility for that tool. It talks a lot about the words, for example, and how the online world and the offline world, even though children don't really make a difference, they are different, and it's reinforcing that difference and how they can complement each other. It talks about social media. It talks about the risks. It talks about the future of the internet. It talks about the different jobs that you can have online, and the different jobs that you could have online in the future, like cloud cleaners or teachers or teaching robots emotions, right? So it kind of, it's a tool for children to access this information, but also for children to read with their parents. So I have a lot of adults who come to me and say, I learned so much with your book. Because, we are expecting parents to be the responsible ones for protecting their children and helping them navigate the online world. And we forget that nobody taught parents how to navigate that world, right? And then parents are unsure, uncertain about how to use technology. So children's perception is, oh, my mom doesn't really understand technology, so I don't ask her for help if I need help, right? We've run global surveys and polls, and most children do perceive that at some point they will be at risk of something online, right? They know that the chances of them experiencing something that might harm them or make them feel unsafe or scared are very high. But who are they going to turn to when that happens if they don't trust that their parents are, know what they're talking about or understand this world? So I think we have a huge challenge of bridging that gap between how children navigate the online world and how do we empower parents to have a close relationship with children around technology.
That's a great answer. I love especially that you mentioned Tim Berners-Lee. We'd love to have him on the podcast. So Tim, if you're listening, thank you.
If you're listening, I'm a huge fan of your work.
But we ask all our guests this final question, so I'm going to ask it to you now. What's next for you? Like, do you have a grand vision of the future that you're working for? Like, what's the dream of like what you're going to do next? Like your next big project, not just next week.
Okay, so Hub is a big project, right? So I think that I'm sticking with that for a while. I think it's, even though we're aiming to be able to publish recommendations next year, we want to socialize them with states, but we need to implement them. How do we take this forward? How do we, it's not enough with making these recommendations and putting them forward. How do we make sure that children are being able to access safety and protection through online means? I think, for me, that's a long-term approach. I'm working on a couple of other books, one on LGBTIQ actually. I also feel that we need like a, internet 2.0 kind of, we're very stuck on the risks online and protect yourself, but how do we empower children to own the online world and make it more ethical and change it, right? So one of the key messages that I always transmit to parents and children is the fact that the internet is not this magical thing, right? We never teach children that human beings created this, that you need technology, you need electricity and power for it to function. You need cables, physical cables that go under the ocean, right? That you cut them, you don't have Wi-Fi, but they're born into this world where access is available, where they open their eyes and they're online. They're connected magically, right? So there's a sense of huge power over you, right? This is powerful and it's more powerful than you. How do we shift that? How do we change that power imbalance and empower children to have power over the online world, and not just power on their own behavior, but on changing it, on making it better? I think that we have we have talked about how the online is an entry point to being safer, and how do we need to enhance that and promote that, but also the online is an entry point to being very unsafe, right? Unfortunately, numbers are rising and rising and rising on child sexual exploitation online, on child trafficking, on scams, and how do we help the future generations know that is something that they can change? I think for me, that's, if there is a future, if there is a world tomorrow after the climate crisis, I'm not very optimistic, I'm sorry. If there is a future, how do we empower these generation to make it better? Because we didn't do a really good job, I think. And we need to, transmit to them that they can. I have another book called Yo Activista, I'm an activist, and that is the message that it sends. Anyone can be an activist. Anyone can help change the world, right? You don't need to be this superhero, right? Publicly voicing, speaking up, but you can do good from your own space, from your own personality. So how do we encourage them to fix what we ruined?
You're really speaking our language. Our podcast is called Into the Digital Future. This is very much what we want to look at and what we want to focus on. So encouraging young people to have more ownership and control over it, I think is a really positive thing. So
thank you so much.
Yes.
It's been such a pleasure to have you here. You've got me thinking, so I'm sure you have all of our listeners thinking about a lot of things. So thank you.
Thank you for
yeah,
having
it was
me.
a wonderful
Great.
conversation. Is there anything else that you think that we've missed that you'd like to share?
Um, I think that mostly for parents to remember when we, engage with our children, we talk to our children, to remember that they are growing up in a different world than the one that we grew up with. And, parents, we tend to replicate how we were brought up, right?
Yeah.
So when before saying things like you won't understand this because you're too young, or it was different in my time, well, let's try and understand the world that they're living in. So how can we help them navigate this world and not necessarily compare it to how we grow up and how we had to do certain things, because this is a different world. So I think the huge challenge is for us to step out of our historical world that doesn't exist anymore, how we grew up, and try and adapt to our children's world today and try and connect with them around that so we can help them navigate this. I wouldn't want to have social media as an adolescent. I think there's so much pressure, right?
Yes, agree.
Yeah, so it's, how do we try and be more empathetic with the challenges that they're facing and try and help them and not try to replicate what we were doing at their age, and offer
Wonderful.
them alternatives to the online world. When we
Yes, of
tell them,
course.
stay off your phone, let's offer them something why don't we go to the park? Why don't we read together? Let's
Yeah,
cook something. We need to offer them alternatives.
this is very true. Oh, that's been fantastic. That was really, really interesting conversation, Lucha. And we're looking forward to seeing where the project goes. And maybe we'll have you back next year and you can come and tell us about the progress that's been made. It's a great project. Thank you so much for coming on.
Hopefully. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks for listening to Into the Digital Future. We hope you had as much fun listening as we had talking. For links and resources about any of the ideas, projects, or initiatives we discussed on this episode, please visit the CUNY Center website at cunycenter.org/future.
Into the Digital Future has been brought to you by Roblox and the Joan Gans CUNY Centre at Sesame Workshop. Your hosts are Jordan Shapiro and Laura Higgins. Matt Clark is our audio editor and production coordinator. We invite you to subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss any episodes on Apple, Spotify, Google, Stitcher, and more.